Yo, what's going on? Hope you are doing well. Welcome to Shop Talk episode number 5. And today we're going to begin breaking into some suspension discussions on the channel. And we are going to be starting with sag. Really excited to use this video as an icebreaker into some suspension discussions because this summer we're going to be going deep on suspension setup here on the channel. I just purchased a data acquisition setup from Motion Instruments, so that will be showing up anytime in the next few weeks. I've also got some coil shocks showing up to do some coil versus air testing. Really excited, some fun videos to come, but for now, let's deep dive into sag. So for starters, what is sag? Well, sag is the percent that your suspension compresses from your static load, so you just chilling on your bike, from its fully extended state. So say you have a 150 millimeter fork, you'll measure the amount of millimeters that your suspension compresses, find what percent that is of your total travel, and that's your sag, at least your static sag. There is also a thing called dynamic sag, which is essentially your average ride height of your suspension over the course of a trail or ride, but you need data acquisition to figure that out, so we will not be discussing that in today's video. Why do you need sag? Well, the whole point of sag is it gives your suspension some room to extend into holes on the trail, which provides you with a smoother ride and more traction. So now that you know what sag is, does it matter? Heck yes, it absolutely matters, like a lot. So sag is super duper important during the suspension setup, given to the fact that it helps you achieve your adequate spring rate. Now, spring rate is the most important aspect of suspension setup. It is the first thing you're going to set up, and with improper spring rate, you're not really going to be able to compensate too much with your oil damping. So nailing your spring rate is going to give you just a better starting point for your compression, your rebound, all sorts of the things. So it's important to nail right off the bat, and sag is going to help you do that. So how does sag help you get to a good starting spring rate? Well, when you're measuring sag, you're the one who's sitting on your bike, which is great. And what that does is that allows sag to take into account, for 1, your body posture on your bike, 2, your weight, and 3, it's going to take into account the specific leverage ratio of your frame. For instance, if you're trying to get your rear shock set up just based on a recommended spring rate from a friend or something, a spring rate on one bike, so say a 400-pound coil rear shock, is going to react differently on different frame designs. For instance, I have an Ibis HD6, it's a VPP bike with a DW link, a 400-pound rear shock coil spring. It's going to feel different on that than it will on a Horselink bike, or whatever other bike you want to test it on. So because of this discrepancy of different bike manufacturers and suspension designs, sag helps you get a good starting spring rate with your specific bike, which is really, really important. Now that we know what sag is and why it matters for your suspension setup, let's dive into how to measure it. For starters, the key with this is to measure your sag the same every single time. Sag is a reference point, so your procedure needs to be the same each go around. Jordy from Fox always stresses this in the Dialed series, and it is a crucial piece of advice. One of the most common pieces of advice when setting up your sag is to put on all of your riding gear. For me personally, I wear a half-shell helmet, riding sunglasses, and occasionally knee pads. So I'm not tossing on that much gear, and to be completely honest with you, most of the time I'm doing my initial bike setup with my sag. I've just finished building up a bike from a frame, I'm covered in grease, and I don't want to toss my riding gear on. So I just don't, but I do it the same every single time, so that's what matters. I'm sorry if that makes you cringe, but that's just realistic, and I just want to be honest with you and show that realistically what matters is you're doing it the same every single time. To further elaborate on that point just a little bit, the reason why I feel so comfortable doing my sag in just whatever clothes I was building my bike in is because my weight from my riding kit to just my street clothes weight isn't crazy between the half-shell helmet, knee pads, etc. Like, it's not a huge difference, and naturally your body weight fluctuates a little bit day to day regardless. Now, with that said, if you are someone who rides with a water backpack, full face helmet, things that will add a fairly substantial amount of weight to your riding weight, I would definitely do your sag with that stuff on. My reason for recommending this is that you want your sag measurement at home to be somewhat close to the way that a bike manufacturer would measure their sag, which is oftentimes with the riding gear on, or at least that's what most bike brands claim. Now, the reason for this is bike brands give you an estimated sag range that you should have your bike in. That's a really great starting point. We're going to discuss that a little bit more in just a moment, but essentially, you want your reading at home to be as accurate as it could be to what the bike manufacturer would be, so you can get your setting close to where they would want your bike to be ran. Another piece of advice that I see oftentimes mentioned in sag setup videos is to set sag with your compression all the way open. Now, I personally don't do this, and I see both sides. For my particular case on the subject, most suspension tuning guides recommend to set your compression to the middle setting for your first ride after you've set your sag, of course. So I think that that's generally a good place to set your sag, because in case you run into a situation out on the trail where you want to double check your sag, you're not going to want to open up your clickers all the way. Like, yes, you should write those down so you're going to know where they're at, but that's just kind of one thing you don't want to have to think about. So I just set my initial sag with my compression in the middle, and I've done some back-to-back testing doing my sag with the compression all the way open, some in the middle. Doesn't make a massive difference by any means, so that's my particular stance. Now, if you do tend to run a lot of oil damping in your riding, then doing your sag with your compression tuned in may be a good thing, and then if you just want to go by the book, doing it with your compression all the way open could also be a good thing. So I think there's a bit of personal preference there, but once again, do it the same every time. That's just my way of going about it. One thing that I see as a crucial step before setting your sag is to open up your suspension to see what kind of volume spacers you've got in your fork and shock. For the most part, if you've purchased a complete bike, the suspension is going to come with about the adequate number of volume spacers. It's not going to be like crazy ramped up in terms of your spring rate, but it should be kind of about where you want to be. So if you want to skip this step, I honestly don't blame you. Now, if you've bought some aftermarket suspension and built a bike up from the frame, then it's not going to be as dialed. It's still going to be in a pretty good spot. Like if you buy a 180 mil fork from Marzocchi or Fox, like your volume situation is going to be about where you want it. Like it'll probably come with 1 or 2, which is about where you want to be. Well, personal preference, of course. But it's just kind of a good thing to take note. Like that's obviously going to make a big impact on the bottoming resistance of your fork and your feel. So it's good to know where you're at. Pop up the top cap off your fork, see how many spacers you got there. Same with the shock. Write it down and then start testing from there. Now that we've discussed a boatload of nitty-gritty details when it comes to suspension, we've got another thing to cover, and that is pumping up your suspension. So when you're airing up your fork and shock, I would strongly recommend reading your service manual and seeing after how many PSI it's recommended to balance your positive and negative air chambers. This is absolutely crucial. It's commonly overlooked and something you absolutely need to do. So for instance, when you're pumping up a bomber air rear shock, which I've got on my bike, I actually don't know what it's actually recommended to do, but every 25 PSI, I cycle the shock. So to do that, I push it down, and at about a quarter of the travel, I would say, like around sag, you're going to hear like a tss noise. You'll feel it too in the stroke of the shock, and that is the rear shock balancing its 2 chambers of positive and negative air. Now do that every single 25 PSI until you're near your desired starting PSI. I typically go just a bit over and then drop it down to where I want to start. And then you're in a good starting point. Positive and negative chambers are dialed in, and you can begin measuring your sag. Now that I just mentioned that you do every 25 PSI and then cycle the shock, I figured I'd actually just see what the service manual says. And they're saying just to go up to your body weight and then cycle it and then check your sag. So, hey, do as you please. Marzo's pretty set and forget, pretty simple. So if you're super tweaky, nerdy like me, maybe every 25 PSI is going to get you stoked, but you can also keep it simple. So now that we've talked about the importance of balancing your positive and negative chambers, let's talk about what starting PSI you should be working with. So for me, on my fork, I just go to what it recommends on the sticker for my body weight. There's typically a little sticker on the bottom of the fork leg that's pretty helpful. And for the rear shock, I would say there's kind of 2 main ways you could kind of go about that. If it is the shock that came with your bike, there is likely a recommended setting from the manufacturer, or in the case of the Marzo user manual, just go to your body weight, measure your sag, and adjust from there. To give a bit of credibility to the whole going up to your body weight for your rear shock and then checking your sag, I'm actually rocking 175 PSI in my rear shock, and I weigh 175 pounds. So maybe a bit of a coincidence. I don't see that working on all bikes, but at least in my case, that's some good credibility to that technique. With your fork or shock all pumped up to your desired starting pressure, you obviously got to pop your shock pump out. I just wanted to cover a quick thing that's another misconception certain people have. When you're removing your shock pump, that extra little tss that you hear when it pops off, that's not coming from your fork or shock. That's actually the excess air that's in the hose of your shock pump, whichever brand of shock pump you use. So whatever the gauge is saying, whether digital or analog, that's what's in your suspension. So just a good little point to bring up there. And when you reattach the shock pump, it's going to read lower because it has to fill back up that air hose. So that's just what's going on in that situation. That is something that kind of frustrated me for a long time, and then someone told me that, so just figured it's a little tidbit of knowledge I'd pass on to you. All right, now that we've covered just about every technique that I could think to recommend to you, let's go ahead and measure sag. So for me, I take my bike off the stand, I move my bike stand out of the way so that I can use the edge of my bike rack to hold up the handlebar of my bike. I then hop on my bike, push the dust wipers all the way down, give it a couple of little bounces while I'm in a relatively neutral / I guess aggressive-ish riding position. I just kind of know by feel. I then push my wipers down and I get off my bike very, very carefully. One thing to note, do not pull your brakes while you're doing your bounces. I'll occasionally hit my front brake while I'm getting off, and that's okay because you've essentially measured your sag at that point as long as you don't bounce like crazy on the way off. So pulling your brake on the way off won't impact your reading, pulling it during will. So just a little piece of advice there. Now that your dust wipers are moved into place, you're going to take a tape measure, digital caliper, whatever tool you want to use, and you're going to measure the amount of millimeters that the dust wiper moved under your load. Find what percent that is of your total suspension, and there is your sag. Another quick note, don't scratch your stanchion, especially if you're using a digital caliper like me. A sharp metal edge near your stanchion can lead to some issues. Don't let it be an issue. Now that you have your initial sag measurement, you can adjust your spring rate with your shock pump until you're at about what your recommended sag ranges are for both your fork and your shock from your bike manufacturer. I would strongly recommend this. They've done a lot of testing, and their suggested range for the fork and shock is going to be the best place that you can start for your first ride. In my particular instance with the Ibis HD6, they recommended 25% in the rear and 20% in the front. And with my current setup, after a boatload of testing, I'm running 25% in the rear and 22% in the front. So they're kind of onto something. I'd strongly recommend it. It may take a few rounds of measuring your sag before you get to that desired range, and then you're going to be set and ready to hit the trail. If you're really into tweaking on your bike, like me, one thing I'd recommend for you that I've not seen really recommended by anyone else is when you start narrowing in on your sag range, after you've made some spring rate adjustments and things like this, if there is still some variance that's making you question, what you can do is just measure your sag 3 times and take the average of the 3. So that's just something that I do. Maybe I'm a crazy tweaky dude for doing that, but it's a good little technique if you're seeing some variance in your sag measurements. Now you've got your sag set and you're just about ready to ride. As I mentioned earlier, I do my compression in the middle, high and low speed if your fork has it. And for rebound, I do that based on the sticker on the back of the fork and the service manual that comes with the rear shock. Typically, it's based on your air pressure, as rebound is relative to your air pressure. If you have high and low speed, adjust accordingly. If you just have one clicker, adjust that to what it says, and just about ready to hit the trail. After all of that, your very last step is to write down your settings. This is key. You need to know what your starting point is. I would do it in either a notebook. I just use the Notes app on my phone. Whatever works for you best. Write them down. Do your volume spacers, air pressure, rebound, compression, high and low speed if that's an option on your suspension. It's absolutely key before you make any changes out there on the trail. You've got your sag set, compression set, rebound set, and your settings are written down. It's time to ride. Now, for this first ride, what you're gonna look for is a short section of trail that you can ride the same over and over. Now, the key is that this section is short. You don't want to be doing a huge lap every time because then your body's going to be wearing out, and you want to be feeling what's changing with the bike and not your physical performance out there on the trail as the bike rider. I've definitely been guilty of this, and it's a key mistake to avoid. Now, for these first few laps, you're going to be looking at your total travel use. So if you're using all of your travel and you're bottoming out, you're going to add air pressure. If you're not using all of your travel, you're going to subtract air pressure. Sounds pretty simple. It does get a little bit more complicated. If you are in the situation where you're adding so much air pressure to where it just seems a little bit crazy, your fork might start feeling harsh off the top or rear shock, it's time to add a volume spacer. So a volume spacer will give you some added bottom out resistance, allows you to run a more normal sag range, and it's just gonna make your fork feel a heck of a lot better. Without any volume spacers, you might have to run a crazy high PSI, low sag, it's gonna feel harsh, too much volume spacer and it's gonna feel really wallowy, not much support, too much sag. So it's a balance, you gotta play with it. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you just keep dropping pressure, that's totally okay. For the most part, a complete bike is not gonna come with a crazy amount of volume spacers, aftermarket suspension, nothing too crazy. So I wouldn't really sweat removing the volume spacers from a stock bike or aftermarket suspension. You're probably good just to keep dropping your PSI. Now, you may have noticed that in between all those changes that I was recommending you to make, I did not recommend to check your sag. Now, the reason for this is that sag is really important and it does matter a lot, but it's just your starting point. And hopefully it was a really good one. Now, in the case that it was a little bit off, then it's worth to double check your sag. As I mentioned, sometimes I will double check my sag at the truck if something was a little wonky in my suspension setup. For instance, when I was doing the rear shock on the HD6, I had to add like quite a bit of pressure and I was like, yo, what's going on here? So I double checked the sag at the truck and that was really useful. But for the most part, it's just your starting point and you go from there. After all that discussion, what's the bottom line? Does sag matter? Heck yes, it absolutely matters. It is by far the best way to do your initial bike setup when it's time for a new bike or new suspension. Whatever reason you may have to set up your suspension differently, it's a great starting point. But as you adjust your bike and find a feeling that works really well for you, it's not something that I would absolutely live or die by. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Shop Talk. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any opinions of your own on sag, please drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear it, and we'll catch you in the next video. Peace.